Thank you for joining me for today's episode of Once Upon a Crime. Welcome to Season 9. In our first true crime series this season, I'll share cases of family annihilators. A family annihilator is a parent, most often a father, who murders several members of their immediate family in a short period of time. One infamous example of a family annihilator is John List, who I covered in Season 1 of this podcast, Episode 39. John List murdered his wife, children, and mother before going on the run for 17 years. In today's case, I'll tell you the story of Ronald Gene Simmons. Simmons is unique in that he not only killed his family members in a methodically planned way over several days, but also continued his killing spree to exact revenge on employers and others. This is Chapter 1 of Deadly Dads, Ronald Gene Simmons. Ronald Gene Simmons was obsessed with having things in order. His possessions were cataloged and notated in ledgers, journals, and on scraps of paper. He kept a careful written account of every penny spent, from the amount spent on groceries each week to how much was saved by clipping coupons for toothpaste, cleaning products, and other household necessities. When he was being investigated for the murders of 16 people in the late 1980s, investigators would find stacks of files, account books, and letters that chronicled the most mundane to the most shocking details of Ronald Gene Simmons' life. It would be a boon for the prosecution, but ultimately unnecessary. Simmons quickly confessed to the mass murder of 14 of his family members and 2 others, and requested that he receive the death penalty. Like he had all his life, Simmons wished to be in control of his life and his death. He applied the same wish to his wife and children. Simmons kept a tight rein on nearly every movement his family made, and when he felt that power slipping from his grasp, he set out to destroy them. Ronald Gene Simmons was born on July 15, 1940 in Chicago, Illinois, to Loretta and William Simmons. His parents married in 1934 and had their first son, Robert William, a year later. But when he was still an infant, his parents divorced. This was uncommon and somewhat of a scandal in Loretta's small-town Iowa community. A determined and headstrong woman, Loretta packed up her baby and returned to college, graduating in 1937. 2 years later, she and William remarried. They relocated to Chicago, and Ronald Gene was born 6 weeks prematurely in 1940. Ronald Gene would be called by his middle name, Gene. His premature birth resulted in Gene being frail and frequently ill during his first few years. Because of this, and the fact that he was 5 years younger than his brother, Loretta provided baby Gene with her undivided attention. When Gene was not quite 2 years old, his sister Nancy was born. Gene quickly grew jealous of the attention given to the new baby and entered his terrible twos with a vengeance. He would cry and scream and throw himself on the floor to force his mother's attention back to him. The family was thrown into upheaval when William Simmons died as a result of a massive stroke when Nancy was just a few months old. Loretta, now widowed with 3 children to support, returned to her family in Iowa and took a position as a clerk with the War Department. Just 9 months after her husband's death, Loretta married William Griffin, a civil engineer 15 years her senior, who was employed with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Loretta and William added another child to the family in 1945, a son they named Peter Ira Griffin. The following year, Loretta gave birth to twin boys. Like Gene, they were born prematurely, but tragically, neither survived more than a few hours. In 1946, Griffin was transferred to Little Rock, Arkansas. The family settled in a rural area 70 miles from the city near the Ozark Forest. Gene's happiest memories of his childhood would be while living there. He dreamt of one day raising a family in Arkansas and living a simple life in the countryside. Later, he'd even try to purchase the property where he'd lived from the ages of 6 to 10, but would be unsuccessful. His time in this rural paradise was short-lived. In 1950, his stepfather moved the family to the suburbs to be closer to his job. Gene, always with a vociferous need for attention, became even more difficult to handle as he reached his preteen years. He was jealous of his younger siblings and would tease and bully them unmercifully. He blamed them for his own bad acts and throw a tantrum when his mother called him on his lies. His younger brother Pete would say, quote, "He just couldn't stand to be questioned. He had to be right, had to be boss. He'd throw a really big fit if you crossed him on that. Things just had to be his way," end quote. Gene defied authority at home and school. He refused to be told what to do. In Gene's eyes, he was always in the right, and everyone else could go to hell if they didn't agree. In 1953, at 13, Gene's behavior and refusal to do schoolwork resulted in his parents enrolling him in the Morris Academy, a Catholic boarding school 70 miles away. He fought it all the way and whined and complained so incessantly that Loretta finally gave in and allowed her son to come home after just 3 months. His attitude did not improve, however. If anything, it was worse now that he'd exerted power over his parents' authority. By now, both of Gene's parents were experiencing health issues, and the added stress of dealing with their demanding son proved to be too much. When he was a boy, Griffin had resorted to using the belt on his stepson as a last resort to keep him in line. Now that Gene was a teenager, he threatened to, quote, knock his stepfather's head off if he ever raised a hand to him again. In 1955, his parents re-enrolled him in the Morris Academy. This time he would remain there for an entire school year. In the meantime, William Griffin was suffering from asthma and allergies to such a degree that the family decided to move to a more arid climate. He requested a transfer that was granted. The family moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico. Gene finished the school year and returned to his family in June 1956. At first, Gene's attitude and behavior seemed improved, but within a month, he began to rebel once more. He was unhappy in his new home and made no friends at school. Truth be told, Gene had never been one to make friends. He acted superior to his classmates and isolated himself rather than attempting to fit in. In the end, it wouldn't matter because just one semester into the school year, Griffin was transferred once more, this time to Berkeley, California. Gene only spent a month at Berkeley High School before Loretta and William found a home in nearby Mill Valley. But Gene had had enough of school by this point and soon dropped out of Tamalpais High. Gene, encouraged by his parents, finally took a job that summer working as a busboy at a golf club. But before long, an incident occurred in which he returned to the kitchen, covered in garbage. His hair and clothes were strewn with orange peels, coffee grounds, food, and grease. He refused to tell anyone what happened and walked out, not even returning to pick up his last paycheck. On September 5, 1957, Ronald Gene Simmons enlisted in the U.S. Army. Surprisingly, it would turn out to be a good decision. Simmons thrived under the clear-cut rules and regulations of military service. He was also self-serving and calculated enough to figure out loopholes in the system to get his way. Whether that was where he was stationed, what type of work he was doing, or how to use his position to his advantage. He was first stationed at Bremerton Naval Base in Washington, D.C. There, he met 18-year-old Rebecca Olibari. Rebecca, or Becky, as her family called her, was born in New Mexico as the youngest of 5 children. Her father abandoned the family when Becky was just a little girl. Her mother, May, remarried, and her new husband, Andy Novak, moved the family to a 400-acre ranch 14 miles from Walsenburg, Colorado. Becky would always pine for her home in New Mexico. She was reaching her teen years when she was presented with a new stepfather. Abandoned by her father and never feeling like her new one accepted her, Becky romanticized having a man in her life who would love and care for her. She immediately fell for Gene Simmons' tough talk and swagger and his promises of a bright future. Simmons was immediately drawn to the pretty, petite, dark-haired Becky. She was quiet and shy and had no real experience with boys. Her sister Vi encouraged her to volunteer at the USO, or United Service Organization dances that catered to enlisted men. Becky, never happy in Colorado, had accepted her sister Vi's invitation to live with her in Washington, D.C. Becky loved to dance to the sappy love songs of the 1950s. In an attempt to get her sister to come out of her shell, she encouraged Becky to volunteer as a dance partner for the soldiers who attended the dances. Gene also had no experience dating, but perhaps that's because he was looking for a specific type. He found what he was looking for in Becky Ulibarri. She was insecure and had felt unloved all her life. She had no loving male figures in her life and was starved for attention and affection. She'd had some dates in Washington, D.C., but when she met Gene, she fell head over heels. Gene, in turn, made Becky the center of his world. Becky gave him the undivided love and devotion he'd craved since he'd first felt replaced by his baby sister at age 2. In Becky, he found someone who treated him like the sun rose and set on him, something he always felt he deserved. They began planning their future together right away. In July 1960, 19-year-old Becky wed 20-year-old Ronald Gene Simmons. A year later, their first child, Ronald Gene Jr., was born. Gene received orders to report to San Diego after his son's birth. He was assigned to the USS Henrico and would remain at sea for the next year, with just 1 2-week leave to see his family. He deposited Becky and the newborn at her parents' home in Colorado before shipping off. Simmons hated being away from his wife and child, and Becky was also desperate for her husband to return. She was miserable living with her mother and her stepfather, and heartsick over her husband's absence. She wrote scads of letters to him, always calling him "my Gene," expressing how much she missed him and pledging to do everything she could to make him happy once he returned. Gene's missives were full of advice, corrections, and criticisms for his wife, telling her how she should be caring for the baby, the home, and any other details of daily life she shared with him. On July 13, 1961, Simmons was released from the Navy and took a civilian job at a bank. He thought he might make banking his career, and even took a few classes at the local community college. But before long, he discovered he disliked the job and quit. He had an arrogant attitude with customers, and his coworkers disliked him. Simmons said he was judged for, quote, who he was and not what he could do. He re-enlisted in the service, joining the Air Force in 1963, and would serve for the next 16 years. He took a series of clerical and administrative positions in which he excelled and received promotions and accolades. In 1963, he completed the Air Force Records Management and Training course. He was assigned to Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. In 1966, he had been promoted to Staff Sergeant, but as the war in Vietnam escalated, Simmons worked out a plan with his commanding officer. Simmons would re-enlist if he were guaranteed a position at the OSI, or Office of Special Investigations, in Saigon. This was granted, and Simmons shipped out in August, leaving his wife and now 3 children in a tiny trailer near her family in Colorado. He provided only $40 monthly for their living expenses and required her to document every penny she spent. In 1968, Simmons returned home and began a post at the OSI office in San Francisco. It was the summer of love in the city. San Francisco was a hotbed at that time of everything Simmons despised: hippies, drugs, and freedom of expression. Simmons began collecting firearms at this time. He'd gained experience shooting various weapons while in the Army. His father-in-law would say that Gene was a crack shot, even better than himself, who'd grown up hunting and shooting. Simmons couldn't get his family out of San Francisco fast enough. He'd go on paranoid rants to Becky and his children about the dangers of drugs, perverts, and foreign-born people and people of color. He wished to move his family to a more, quote, wholesome environment, he said. Gene Simmons wanted to recreate the place he had been happiest in his life for his family, living on an isolated farm or ranch, far away from, quote, outside influences. In this way, he'd have total control over his family. Simmons justified this goal by saying that only by taking them away from dangerous and evil influences found in the city could he protect them. He also drilled into his wife and children that they must obey his rules if they wanted to live a life of safety and security. He got them out of San Francisco when his request for a transfer to Travis Air Force Base 50 miles to the north, was granted in 1968. They lived in Fairfield, California for the next 4 years before he was transferred to England in 1973. Simmons's mother, Loretta, died of cancer in 1970. 3 weeks after her death, he collected a lump sum on a life insurance policy he'd taken out on her. With this payout, he moved his family out of base housing and into a home in Fairfield. By the time Simmons was transferred to England, his family had grown to 7 members. After Gene Jr. came Sheila Marie 2 years later. William, or Billy, was born in 1956, Loretta in 1970, and Edward, or Eddie, in 1973. In time, they'd add 2 more children to their brood, Marianne in 1976 and Becky in 1979. Simmons was unhappy in England and became more critical of his wife. The children had often heard him yelling and their mother crying behind closed doors. Now Gene began hitting his wife in front of the children. Their second-born child, Sheila Marie, was now a preteen. Gene, who'd always favored Sheila, began making inappropriate comments about his 12-year-old daughter and leering at her developing body. It was uncomfortable for everyone in the family who was old enough to notice, but no one commented. At times, Loretta, 6 years younger, would become jealous of the special treats and attention her older sister received from their father. Gene Jr., the firstborn, was treated harshly by his father, criticized and berated, much as his mother experienced. In 1976, Simmons was transferred back to the U.S. He was given a plum assignment at the Cloudcraft Observatory in New Mexico. Becky was thrilled to be returning to the States, and especially to her home state of New Mexico. But Gene still had his heart set on Arkansas. He traveled there alone to look for property that he hoped to purchase for his retirement, which was just a few short years away. He was very disappointed to discover that the property where he lived as a child was not for sale, and he could not afford it if it were. Simmons came up with Plan B. He purchased a dilapidated building on a couple of acres 12 miles southwest of Cloudcraft in Wills Canyon. He intended to put the family to work, clearing the land, improving the small living quarters, and learning to live off the land. Simmons only had a rudimentary knowledge of construction and no experience running a farm, but his self-confidence had always trumped his common sense. Becky and the children spent long hours after school and household chores, working to clear the land and construct flimsy buildings at Gene's direction. They hadn't gotten very far except to go deeper into debt when Simmons received orders that he was being transferred once again. In June 1978, the military deactivated the Cloudcraft site. Simmons had the option of being assigned to another post, possibly away from his family for an extended period, or take early retirement at half his usual salary. He was given a short reprieve when he was given an assignment at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. Within months, the stress level in the Simmons household increased exponentially. They went deeper into debt after Gene purchased all-terrain vehicles and invested in property. Becky was pregnant for the 7th time. Gene had forbidden his wife to use birth control, but she'd finally defied him and had an IUD implanted. He complained so much that she finally had it removed and soon became pregnant with their last child, also named Becky, born in 1979. Becky experienced complicated pregnancies, especially as she aged, and her doctor warned her that her life could be at risk if she continued to have children. He advised her to have a tubal ligation after the birth of her 7th baby. Gene became angry and forbade it. Becky pleaded with him, scared that she would die and leave her children motherless. He finally relented, but he would never forgive her. He called her terrible names, saying she was, quote, no longer a woman and couldn't be a proper wife to him. He may have said these things partly because he'd already turned his attention and affection to his daughter, 16-year-old Sheila Marie. Ronald Gene Simmons had been grooming his firstborn daughter, Sheila Marie, to be his substitute wife since she was a child. He'd always considered her the prettiest, the smartest, and the most devoted to him. This was the most crucial factor for any woman in Simmons's life. His mother had turned her attention away from him when his younger sister was born, and then again when she had more children with his stepfather. He had expected complete devotion from his wife, who'd done everything possible to defer to her husband in all matters and feed his oversized ego. But when it came to putting her life on the line, Becky finally drew a line in the sand. Gene took this as a sign of disrespect and her rejection of him. It also provided a convenient excuse for what he'd had in mind for years, to focus his full attention on Sheila Marie. Sheila reveled in her father's love and attention as a little girl. It was clear early on to everyone in the family that Sheila was the favored child. Gene's almost obsessive love for Sheila often made Becky uncomfortable. He always seemed to have his hands on their oldest daughter, patting her butt, putting his hand on her knee, caressing her leg under her dress. But Becky considered herself grateful that he was so loving towards his children. Becky had felt unloved as a child, and she told herself it was a good thing that Gene could show such outward signs of love towards his children. As she grew up, Sheila considered her father her hero and constantly wanted to be in his presence. He always invited her along on errands, only sometimes inviting her siblings. It made her feel special, and she drew pictures and wrote poems to her father, expressing her love in her childlike scrawl. Simmons kept every one of these notes, letters, and poems filed away like he did almost every scrap of paper he ever received. And he took photos, lots and lots of photos. There were the typical family photos of holiday gatherings and birthday parties. He documented every family outing with his camera. Increasingly, Sheila Marie was front and center in these photos. In many, she is perched on her father's lap. Once she is clearly in her teens, these pictures become more awkward and Sheila appears uncomfortable. After the mid-1970s, his wife Becky appears only infrequently in photos. Simmons had already begun treating his teen daughter as if she were his wife. At the end of the summer of 1980, Simmons was forced to make a decision about his military career when he was told he was being assigned to a post in Turkey. His family would remain behind in the U.S. Simmons decided to take an early retirement rather than be away from his family. Simmons' greatest need at this time was to keep Becky and his children under his control and Sheila Marie close to him. He became increasingly anxious as young Sheila blossomed into a young woman. She was his princess, whom he affectionately called Ladybug, and he was panicked at the thought that horny teenage boys might come sniffing around her. She was his, and he couldn't take that chance. Even though he was deeply in debt and his salary was being cut in half, Simmons was determined to purchase and build his family compound in Arkansas. He convinced himself that all his dreams would come true if his ladybug, Sheila Marie, was by his side. In September 1980, Ronald Gene Simmons recently retired from his decorated military career and now struggling to figure out how to make ends meet, decided to take a road trip to California. Leaving his wife and 6 other children home in New Mexico, he drove to California with his 17-year-old daughter, Sheila. On the way, he told her all about his hopes and dreams for the family. He said he would protect her and take care of her forever. He promised her she'd have everything she'd ever dreamed of. He professed his undying love for his ladybug and said she was the key to the family's happiness. "I don't think Mom can do it anymore," he explained. He told her he had needs that her mom could no longer fulfill. "I love you, I really love you," he told Sheila by the light of the dashboard as he drove down the interstate. "You are the woman of the family now, just like I'm the man. Do you know what that means? You're the only one I can count on, the only one who can make me happy," he said. "As long as I know you love me, everything will work out fine. You do love me, don't you, princess?" Sheila assured her father that she did love him. Simmons stopped at a motel in Phoenix where he paid for a room with 2 double beds. When Sheila came out of the bathroom dressed for bed, he told her the motel would charge extra if they used both beds. She got into bed beside him. Professing his undying love for her, Ronald Gene Simmons raped his teenage daughter. When they returned home, Sheila was quiet and subdued. Jean got to work planning the family's future. Becky did her best to calm her anxieties about what was happening in her marriage and in her home. Her husband treated her with contempt. She was exhausted from raising the children and keeping the house up to Jean's standards. And she was lonely. Jean had begun sleeping in the other room. Most nights she snuggled with the baby and one of her other children to not feel so desperately lonely. Twice that fall, Jean picked his daughter up from school in the family's van, drove her to a nearby parking lot, and had sex with her. In March, Sheila could no longer deny the obvious. She was pregnant. She reported this to her father. To her surprise, he seemed pleased. A few days later, on the night of her senior prom, which Jean insisted she attend and made a big show of buying her the perfect dress, he sat his wife down and told her that Sheila was expecting a baby and he was the father. He said it was not a problem, and they all needed to support Sheila now. He concluded his speech by telling his shocked wife that he didn't want to hear any questions or comments. Then he left the room. Becky fell into a depression. She felt sick at what her husband had confessed with no more emotion than if he told her he'd just cut her grocery budget. Days later, unable to keep her feelings to herself, she spoke with her son, Gene Jr., who was now attending college in another city. Gene Jr. was disgusted and furious with his father. He told his mother he was going to the police, but she pleaded with him not to do anything. She was nearly hysterical with fear about what would happen if his father was arrested. So Gene Jr. reluctantly agreed to keep quiet. But he soon spilled the secret to a friend, who urged him to report it to the police or social services. In April, Gene Jr. called the Department of Human Services in Cloudcraft. They opened an investigation and soon learned that there were already rumors circulating in town about Sheila Simmons' inappropriate relationship with her father. The district attorney in Otero County was alerted, and Sheila was interviewed at her high school by a social services caseworker. The caseworker was stunned when Sheila readily admitted that she was pregnant and her father, Robert Gene Simmons, was the father. Simmons was interviewed next. He also admitted that he'd impregnated his daughter. He told the caseworker that he, quote, had to do it to protect her from sexual predators. He concluded this interview by saying, quote, anyway, it's all over with. The caseworker reported this shocking confession to the Otero County prosecutor. Still, no arrest warrant was issued for Simmons, nor was Sheila or Simmons' other children taken into protective custody. Instead, to assess Gene Simmons for a possible mental illness, he was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. He began seeing a therapist at the Holloman Air Force Base Mental Health Clinic. A psychiatrist also interviewed Sheila. The doctor reported to the prosecutor that Sheila's, quote, emotional immaturity was a result of a dysfunctional family unit. In the summer of 1981, an arrest warrant was issued for Ronald Gene Simmons, charging him with incest. He abruptly left the state for Arkansas before the warrant was served. He took Sheila, her baby daughter, Sylvia Gale, who was only a few weeks old, and his 3 younger children, Eddie, Marianne, and Becky, with him. Simmons left his wife and the older children to pack up the house. Becky met Gene in Arkansas with Loretta, Billy, and Gene Jr. in tow. From 1982 to 1983, Gene tried to keep his family intact and run things as he had before he became a fugitive. He was hired as file clerk at the Veterans Administration Medical Center in Little Rock, and the family moved into a rented house. Gene did his best to keep both Becky and Sheila happy so as not to rock the boat. He knew his position was precarious. Although he was not worried that either woman would turn them into the authorities, he needed Becky to take care of the house and the children, and he didn't want to lose the love and loyalty of his ladybug Sheila. To keep Sheila happy, he allowed her to enroll in business school. At nearly 20 years old, Sheila was maturing and making new friends. She began flirting with another student named Dennis McNulty. It was her first real romance, and their relationship continued to blossom, at first in secret. So Sheila was devastated when she learned around Christmas 1982 that she was pregnant again. She told her father, and this time he knew he had to keep it a secret from everyone. He took Sheila to a clinic to have the pregnancy terminated. Simmons never had sex with his daughter again. In the summer of 1983, Ronald Gene Simmons finally realized his dream of isolating his family in rural Arkansas. He purchased a plot of land on 13 acres in Pope County and about 4 miles outside of Dover, Arkansas. On it stood a small ramshackle house with no indoor plumbing or heat except a wood-burning fireplace. He dubbed their new home Mockingbird Hill. Simmons told his family that they would have a life of simplicity in a more wholesome environment. He continued to clip articles and read them aloud to his family about murders, rapes, kidnappings, and the rampant drug trade in America's cities. He warned that if they were exposed to such decadence, they would perish or fall prey to an immoral lifestyle themselves. He was so worried about outside influences invading his rural Shangri-La that Simmons wouldn't allow the family to own a telephone. He had a privacy fence installed around his property. In some parts, it was over 10 feet high. In this isolated setting, he had total control over his wife and children. He put his older children to work, digging ditches for drainage pipes and a cesspit for their waste. This continued until the spring of 1984. That summer, Simmons was running low on funds, so he took a job at the Russellville Mini Mart. He'd since given up his job in Little Rock. It was over an hour one way to work, and at that distance, he couldn't keep as close an eye on his family as he liked. The low-paying job in Russellville was quite a step down financially from his former positions with the government. It was a massive blow to his ego. He was also losing control of his family at the same time. Sheila announced her engagement to Dennis, even though her father kept up a constant diatribe about how she was making a big mistake. The nuptials were planned for August 1984. Gene Jr. had married and was expecting his first child. Billy had a full-time job, a better one than his father's, and had purchased a truck. He was making plans to move out of his parents' home. Simmons's last-ditch effort to keep Sheila Marie with him was to warn her that Dennis would dump her as soon as he found out who Sylvia Marie's father was. It came as a shock to him when she responded that Dennis already knew. For Gene, this was the ultimate betrayal, and one for which he'd never forgive his daughter. He stopped speaking to her and refused to pay for the wedding. The family was surprised when he showed up for the ceremony. He sat in the back of the church with a scowl, speaking to no one. Now that he lost Sheila, Simmons's anger was constantly simmering just below the surface. The children tried to stay out of his way as much as possible, so they were glad when he took a second job that kept him away from home most of the week. He began working at Woodline Motor Freight in Russellville. A young secretary named Kathy Kendrick, employed there, was petite with dark hair and a friendly smile. Simmons was immediately attracted to her. She resembled his daughter, Sheila Marie. He became friendly with her, getting to know her and making small talk. When he learned she was having relationship troubles, he played the role of a caring father figure who often went out of his way to ask her how she was doing. She thought he was kind and sometimes took him up on an offer to grab coffee or lunch while on their break. But she soon began to avoid him when he started acting flirtatious. She didn't like how she caught him looking at her body, or when he placed a hand on her knee or shoulder for a beat too long. She began cutting the conversation short, and then left the company altogether to take a job at a law firm across town. Unbeknownst to Kathy, Simmons was still obsessing over her. He'd sit in his car watching her workplace and seething about how she'd rejected him. It was just like his daughter, he thought. She pretended she liked him, but turned on him and humiliated him for no good reason he could discern. At home, he railed to Becky about their daughter and her new husband, Dennis. Simmons absolutely hated his son-in-law and would go on long rants about how ungrateful Sheila was and how sorry she'd be when her world came crashing down. He fantasized about Sheila Marie returning home with her tail between her legs, begging her father to take her back. Becky told him to let it go. Sheila was happy, and Dennis was a good husband. When the couple announced Sheila was pregnant and expecting a son, Gene's mood darkened even further. He took to isolating himself in a back bedroom, sipping beer and eating junk food. He gained such a considerable amount of weight that behind his back, Becky and the children began referring to him as Fatso. The final straw came for Gene when he found out that the secret he believed had been buried within the family, his incestuous relationship with Sheila, and the warrant that had been issued for him in New Mexico had spread to his extended family. Some of Becky's family members knew as did Billy's wife Renata. When Gene told his wife that Sheila's husband Dennis was no longer allowed in their home, she stood up to him. Her daughter and her husband and children could visit whenever they pleased, she told Gene. She finally played her trump card, saying that if he tried to keep her children or grandchildren away from her, she'd report him to the New Mexico authorities. Simmons now knew that he'd lost complete control of his wife and his children. He'd lost everything he felt he'd worked and sacrificed for, and it made him very angry. He decided it must end. He chose the Christmas holidays in 1987 to dole out his revenge. On the morning of December 22, 1987, Ronald Gene Simmons woke with a determination about what he had to do to put things back in balance. For some time now, he'd felt he was losing his grip on his wife and children. Life wasn't supposed to go this way for him, and if he couldn't bend it and his family to his will, then he had to end it for all of them. After the younger children left for the last day of school before Christmas vacation, Simmons took his wife Becky by surprise. He hit her over the head with a crowbar and then shot her with a .22 caliber pistol. His eldest son, Gene Jr., aged 26, was next. He was killed in the same manner as his mother. Gene Jr.'s daughter, 3-year-old Barbara, had been living with the Simmons family while Gene and his wife were working out some marital issues. Simmons went into the child's room and strangled her to death. He moved the 3 bodies to the cesspit behind the house and dumped them in. Simmons then waited for his other children to arrive from school. While he waited, he ate snacks and drank beer. When the children exited the school bus that afternoon, they were surprised to see their father waiting for them. Wary at first, they were pleased to see that he appeared to be in a good mood. He walked with them up the lane, and before entering the house, told 17-year-old Loretta, 14-year-old Eddie, 11-year-old Marianne, and 8-year-old Becky that he had a surprise for them. He had a special Christmas gift for each of them that he was giving them early. But, he explained, he would take them one at a time to receive the gift. While the others waited, Simmons took Loretta into the house and led her into his back room. Once she was inside, he quickly grabbed a nylon rope and looped it around her neck. He pulled it tight until she stopped breathing. To ensure she was dead, he took her to a rain barrel and held her head underwater until he was sure. He brought each of the remaining 3 children into the house and murdered them one after the other in the same manner. Their bodies were also dumped in the cesspit. The rest of his family were scheduled to come and celebrate the holidays with Gene, Becky, and the children on December 26th. Gene waited out the 4 days before their arrival, going about his life as usual. When 22-year-old Billy Simmons arrived with his wife Renata and infant son, Gene shot the adults to death and drowned 20-month-old Trey in the rain barrel. Sheila and her family arrived next. Simmons shot Sheila and Dennis before strangling his 7-year-old daughter Sylvia Gale. Sheila and Dennis's 21-month-old son, Michael, was also strangled. Simmons lined up the bodies of the adults and Sylvia Gale on the dining room floor and covered them with coats. Over Sheila's body, he draped his wife's best tablecloth. He wrapped the bodies of the 2 little boys in plastic. For some reason, he took them out of the house, placing them in the trunks of 2 abandoned cars at the end of the lane. Before closing the trunk, he poured kerosene over the bodies to thwart animals from disturbing their remains. With his family annihilated, Simmons sat for the next 2 days plotting revenge on others who he felt had ruined his life. On December 28th, he drove to Russellville in Gene Jr.'s car and purchased another firearm at Walmart. He then drove to the law firm of Peel, Eddy & Gibbons, where his crush, Kathy Kendrick, was now employed. He walked into the office, pointed the weapon at the 24-year-old woman, and fired several times, unloading the gun. Kathy fell to the floor, dying. As other employees dove for cover, Simmons calmly exited the building, returned to his car, and headed for his next stop, Taylor Oil Company. Once he arrived, he approached Rusty Taylor and fired, hitting him in the chest. Taylor had previously managed the mini-mart where Simmons was employed. Rusty, although seriously wounded, would survive. On his way to shoot Taylor, Simmons shot another employee, 33-year-old Jim J.D. Chafin. The father of 4 lost his life that day solely because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had never met Simmons. It was not yet noon, and police had received several emergency calls about multiple shootings. The next 911 call came from the Sinclair Mini-Mart. Simmons had quit his job at the store just 10 days earlier. He shot and wounded 46-year-old Roberta Woolery and 38-year-old David Salyer for reasons that are unclear. His last stop that morning was to the Woodline Freight Company. He held a grudge against his former supervisor, Elaine Butts, because she'd reprimanded him for harassing Kathy Kendrick. He shot at Elaine, wounding her in the head and chest. He then forced another employee, Vicki Jackson, into an enclosed office and shut the door. He put the gun to her head but said, "Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you." Simmons then made her pick up the phone and call the police. He told her, quote, "I've come to do what I wanted to do. It's all over now. I've gotten everybody who wanted to hurt me." Police arrived and took Simmons into custody without incident. Ronald Gene Simmons was first tried for the murders of Kathy Kendrick and Jim J.D. Chafin in May 1988. Simmons confessed to all the murders and said he'd plead guilty. The prosecutor planned to seek the death penalty. Simmons expressed his desire to be put to death. His attorney explained that he would only be allowed to plead guilty if the prosecutor waived the death penalty. Because of this, Simmons had no choice but to plead not guilty and go to trial. After a 4-day trial, Simmons was found guilty and sentenced to death by lethal injection. He refused all rights to appeal his sentence, stating in writing, quote, "I, Ronald Gene Simmons, Sr., want it to be known that it is my wish and my desire that absolutely no action by anybody be taken to appeal or in any way change this sentence. It is further respectfully requested that this sentence be carried out expeditiously." End quote. On May 31st, Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton signed the execution warrant with the date set for June 21st, 1990. It was the fastest sentence to execution date set in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. On February 10, 1989, after being found competent to stand trial, Simmons was found guilty of 14 counts of capital murder for the murders of his family members and sentenced to death. There were fireworks during the hearing when the prosecutor presented letters they discovered that had been written to Sheila from Simmons. In them, he'd expressed anger at her for revealing that he'd fathered her child, stating that he'd, quote, "see her in hell." Simmons became enraged at the prosecutor, John Bynum, for revealing this in court. Before anyone had time to react, Simmons hauled off and punched Bynum in the face. He attempted to grab a deputy's weapon, but was unsuccessful. He was dragged out of the courtroom by officers. Simmons' right to waive all appeals to his sentence were challenged in court. Attorneys contended that Simmons declining his rights to an appeal in a capital case jeopardized the appellate rights of other prisoners on death row. In fact, Simmons had to be separated from other death row inmates for his protection. On June 25, 1990, Ronald Gene Simmons had his wish granted. He made a statement to the public, quote, "To those who oppose the death penalty, in my particular case, anything short of death would be cruel and unusual punishment." End quote. He was led to the death chamber after refusing any visitors and executed by lethal injection, the method he chose. To the end, Simmons, quote, "had to have it his way," as his brother Pete once stated. No family member claimed his body, and he was buried in a potter's field in Lincoln County, Arkansas. Ronald Gene Simmons ultimately got his plot of land in Arkansas, didn't he? That will do it for this episode of Once Upon a Crime. Thank you so much for listening, subscribing, or following, and telling a friend about the podcast. You can also watch accompanying videos to our episodes on YouTube. Search for the Once Upon a Crime podcast YouTube channel or get the link in the show notes. You can join our Patreon to get all episodes before anyone else and without ads. Go to patreon.com/onceuponacrime to join. and have access to dozens more bonus episodes you can't hear anywhere else, as well as behind-the-scene looks at Once Upon a Crime and more fun content. That's patreon.com/onceuponacrime. There's also a link to that in the show notes. Once Upon a Crime is written and produced by me, Esther Sanchez-Ledlow. My executive producer is Lorena Garcia, and research for this episode was provided by Emma Battaglia. Until next time, be good to one another.